Every person has a story, but not everyone has a place to tell it. I'm Frank Swoboda. I've interviewed amazing people all over the planet. I want you to meet them. This week, the most interesting person you've never heard of is...
Hi, my name is Anna Harbine, and I'm the most interesting person you've never heard of because I know things about Spokane that you don't.
Well, Anna Harbine, welcome to the most interesting person you've never heard of podcast. You're the most interesting curator I've ever had on my show.
Well, thank you.
So welcome. So, you are the curator, right? Of the. Let me see if I can get this right.
I can give you the title.
Go give me the title. I'm going to screw it up.
I am the Johnston Curator of Archives and Special Collections, which is just a really long, fancy, endowed title for archivist.
At the
Northwest Museum of Arts and Culture
here in Spokane. Yeah. So this is basically you're the keeper of the archives of the history.
Yeah, any of the paper, video, photographs, audio, architectural drawings, books. That is what I collect.
Well, and we met you because you helped us on a project that we've been talking about a little bit on the podcast, but have done this web series that we're tackling called Housing and Help, which is a web series about homelessness and how do we solve it. And we just came out with our first episode. The second one's coming out in a couple of weeks, maybe by the time this will come out. This podcast, that second episode will have come out. And so you helped us a ton because we really wanted to take a look at how did we, if there's a homeless problem here, it didn't just show up overnight. It happened. There were things that caused it. And so you really helped us find a bunch of cool photos and images of what Spokane was like in the past. And then we got to meet you and I'm like, oh my gosh, she knows everything about everything. We have to ask her on this show. So how did you get this job? Is it like it seems to me, and I don't know this for sure, but I love people that don't work.
Right.
That are just, all they get to do is the thing that they love, which is what I get to do. And you seem like one of those people. Am I right?
Yeah. So I kind of fell into my current position. There was hard work, but it was also happy accidents. I mean, I was in grad school studying history, thought I'd go work at an embassy, take the Foreign Civil Service exam.
Oh, that's cool.
Go down more...
be a spy?
No.
Is that what you're really talking
more
about?
More like analytics.
You might be one.
Like the person behind the spy desk.
Okay.
More,
right.
Yeah, like more analysis.
Get them out of trouble.
Yeah, or like, these are the ways...
The poison darts and stuff.
These are the way this political situation could go wrong. Those kinds of things. So I was particularly interested in like how art intersects with political revolution. And you see this in like the French Revolution. Who are the ones pushing the ideas that the aristocracy is corrupt? It's playwrights and poets. Most people couldn't read. Yep. So it's playwrights.
There's a guy in the Ukraine doing that right now, isn't there?
Right. Actors. Actors and theater play a huge role. It's same within this... in the Bolshevik Revolution, which leads to the Soviet Union, Lenin was friends with a lot of playwrights and poets and authors and artists. And these people come up with these really new, interesting ways of thinking about art and how we position ourselves in politics with art. And then usually they're the ones killed or targeted by these totalitarian regimes that rise out of these revolutions. Yeah, absolutely. And so that's what I was really interested in. That's what I was studying.
Wow. Cool topic.
And then I just had to pivot. I had an academic advisor who went on leave unexpectedly, and I ended up in this class called Digital History. And being a know-it-all, I complained so much to my husband. I was like, I do not want to be in this class. I don't want to learn how to use Twitter. I don't care about blogs or RSS feeds. Like, I just don't. Like,
and this is at Eastern?
Yeah, this is at Eastern
University.
Yeah. And it ended up being this class that was pretty eye-opening to me because in undergrad,
Your undergrad was at Whitworth.
Right. Yeah. And most college students, especially prior to the recession, because I graduated right around the time in 2009, so like a year after the crash. But I dabbled. Like, what am I interested in? So did a lot of graphic design courses and theater and tech theater and art and philosophy. very traditional liberal arts kind of meandering what I want to do with myself education. And I kind of landed on medieval history, which in hindsight is kind of silly because graduate in a recession. Like,
oh, good, she's gonna get a job.
Yeah, I studied abroad. I actually got to go. I lived in England for a while, and I got to work as an intern for an archaeological firm as an archaeological technician.
Oh wow, that sounds cool.
Well, it sounds cool, but I hated it. I didn't. It's not like over here where if you go onto an archaeological dig site, the archaeologists are all about like teaching you and letting you learn. Like I literally was a hired hand, so my job was taking a thing called a magnometer, which kind of looks like a weed whacker, and poking holes into the ground with it and pushing a button, and it would send out a magnetic pulse. And if it finds metal, so like a coin or like a knife or something, it would send a ping back. Right? Yeah, pretty much. It was a very boring job, and I did it for 6 months. And I came back.
That's not Raiders of the Lost Ark at all.
Yeah, right. And I came back, but it's
no Indiana Jones in that.
It's corporate. It's a corporate system over there. Right. So over here, it's
Indiana
much
Jones
more.
Never used a metal detector.
I'm
pretty sure
it's before his time.
Maybe
It's probably before his
maybe
time.
He did.
But the thing for me was I came out of that going, I like to interpret and connect people to the stuff archaeologists find. I'm not really interested in what they find. I'd much prefer interpreting and
like, oh, they found this thing. Here's what it means.
Let me tell you all the stories about this thing.
Right.
So I finished up undergrad, and then like most people during a recession that graduated, I worked at Borders Books and Macy's, and just kind of couldn't figure out where to land. And I floated the idea, because I'm a lifelong learner and a glutton for punishment. I was taking classes on the side at Spokane Falls Community College just to take classes to keep my...
So you're a person who already graduated from college and wanted to take more classes.
Yeah, it was just a glutton for punishment, right?
Be a lifelong learner.
Yeah. So floated the idea of maybe getting my master's in teaching, and I had multiple teachers tell me, if you really like history, you should actually study history. Which was probably the first time I'd heard that. And so I kind of just like, okay, well, what's around this area? And Eastern, the program was really interesting. There's lots of classes on what I was interested in, which was like communism and like in political science and philosophy. You could do a really intersectional kind of analysis on a subject. Especially the subject I was interested in. And so that's why I just kind of was like, and it's in town, and I don't have to move, and that sounds great. And then because my academic advisor went on leave, I ended up in this digital history class that basically took all of this other experience. So like interest in theater and interest in, computer science, and I knew how to use Photoshop, like things that are
you
just...
had some skills.
Yeah, right. Almost, these are early 2000s.
Right.
And it took those things and it basically married them all into one. Like, there's this thing called public history that takes all of these skill sets, and you can make a career out of it. So
You said, "Mom and Dad, ha ha ha."
I think
I got a job.
I think when so I basically made this really wonderful professor, Larry Sabula, who's the director of their public history program out at Eastern, became my academic advisor, and I just kind of went into the deep end on public history. And I remember after completing my degree, we had a graduation party, and Larry came up to my dad and was like, Anna is so good at what she does. And my dad's chest just like puffed up. And it was like this first time of being like, see, you can make it in history. History does have things you can do, not just be a gym teacher.
Right. Teach.
Everybody tells you, like, you tell them I'm getting a degree in history, and they're like, so you're going to like teach?
Yeah, right.
I am, but in a very different
You are teaching.
avenue.
You're teaching all kinds of stuff. So what does your job entail now? So you got this cool job.
I worked at the Washington State Digital Archives as an intern doing imaging projects. You like scan photographs, all the images you find online had to be scanned by somebody.
Right.
Especially the historic photos. Like they had to be scanned by someone. And it's a really tedious and laborious process. Like it's just.
So you had a problem with the metal detector, but this is okay.
This is totally fine. You can listen to really loud music. And
okay. Well,
and it's a spreadsheet. I mean, that's probably the most boring part.
But you get to look at cool pictures.
Or watch Netflix while you're typing on the computer. Like
okay. Now we're talking.
Queen of multitasking here. But so I started out as like more an imaging specialist, and that's how I ended up at the MAC. Was they were doing a big grant-funded project with the Ferris Foundation on digitizing the Charles Libby photograph collection.
Oh yeah, amazing.
And
amazing guy.
Oh yeah.
I don't know anything about him, and I should.
So
tell me. So honestly, this podcast is about all the questions you've ever had about Spokane that you never knew, and Anna knows all the answers.
Happily tell them.
And you know them all. So Libby was amazing because we used them in the project we just did, but I've been fascinated by this guy. Obviously, I own a video company, and we tell stories all the time, but his photos are amazing. I mean, and I work with a lot of photographers, and this guy's making art turn of the century, phenomenal stuff. So who is this guy?
So Charles Libby was a photographer in Spokane, and his studio ran for 70 years. Oh my God. And it was him and his son. It continued on after the Libbys retired from the business. But Charles himself learned photography from his sister, Addie, who... there's some speculation and records out there about that she spent some time working with Ashell Curtis and Edward Curtis.
Edward
Curtis is this famous Native American photographer.
He's amazing. I love everything about him. Yeah.
Right.
My wife's a big fan of Edward Curtis. He's phenomenal.
Well, and Addie Libby was...
who, just for people that don't know, he really had the brilliant idea of photographing all the Native American chiefs, or at least the elders of the Native American tribes around the country, to preserve that because they were soon going to die. Yeah, and he got some of the most iconic
and
photos.
He was really concerned about
knew Teddy Roosevelt. I mean,
and he was concerned about the influence of like Western culture on these communities and tribes that had lived in a completely different lifestyle. Ironically, he, there's stuff, he's just an interesting guy. He'll like edit out, there'll be like an alarm clock in a photo inside of a teepee, and he'll edit it out.
Right, because you guys had the MAC had a big exhibit on a couple years ago. It was phenomenal.
So, so Addie Libby, Charles's sister, supposedly studied under them. She was
probably.
It's likely. They lived
even when you look at the photos of Libby and you look at them, they're not dissimilar.
Yeah. So Addie lived in Olympia, and she learned photography over on the Puget Sound area before they came to Spokane. Okay. And Charles worked for her. And they came over, I can't remember exactly, but the late 1890s, and Charles started working out of her studio. Now, the difference between Addie and Charles is that Addie is of the school of art photography. This is in a period where photography was not seen as an art form.
Really?
It was seen as like a hobby and like something you do for commercial purposes. But it in and of itself is not artistic. And so you would have these art studios where they would literally take your photograph and then like draw on it to make it artistic. So like detail, like airbrushing or like Photoshop right now. Yeah. So, but it was to turn it into an art form. So like take the pen and the brush to the painting, and so that the painting becomes the medium that then you build your art on. And it's art studio.
It was
studio
portraiture. A little archaic compared to sort of art.
Well, it's very much like trying to prove yourself as a painter style medium artist.
I see.
Artistry, because they looked at photography and they were like, you just point and shoot. Like, how is that art? That was the early critique.
Right.
But then you get people like Charles Libby, who saw this huge opportunity in commercial photography. Mm-hmm. So just taking photos as they are, not doctoring them, not taking them in some fancy studio with backdrops, but actually just
documenting
photographing.
Real life. Right.
And people would pay a pretty penny to have their photographs taken.
Right.
So he starts out on his own in his own studio around 1903, and then he's
just
officially.
When this town is really getting going.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the height of our population is like 1910 for this period, and we're one of the larger cities in the United States, and
Western boomtown here. Yep.
Yeah, and and Libby is this guy that is like right there, right time, right moment. He's taking photographs of the falls, selling those to the Chamber of Commerce, who's then selling those to like railroad companies to put them in books. He is building a name for himself, and he basically. By the 1930s, his son is now old enough to be in the studio, and they become like the official photographers for the Grand Coulee Dam construction. Wow. So he's taking pictures of FDR and these big DC politicians who are coming out and viewing the development through these New Deal ideas. So Libby's just this great guy, and we ended up with over it's like 250,000 photographic prints and negatives. Now, out of that, there's probably about 40,000
usable
images.
Good,
there's
quality.
multiple pictures of the same thing, or pictures of open caskets, stuff that's more sensitive, and you just don't.
10 different shots that he shot at the same time.
And
you pick the best one.
As an archivist, part of it.
We all understand that because we have thousands that we take every day on our phones.
We have so much more now than we did then. But you as an archivist are constantly balancing things like sensitivity things, or he was the commercial photographer for car accidents for insurance companies. So there's those kinds of photos as well, and it's really just a documentation of
He's
the
a commercial
guy.
Yeah,
the commercial interest of the studio.
Guy. It's not dissimilar in some ways.
Yeah, so it's this really amazing snapshot of
time,
the 20th century in Spokane.
Wow.
And, they retire right after, his son retires right after Expo 74.
It's pretty poignant time.
And it becomes more of an aerial commercial photography company beyond that. And then the museum purchased a bunch of the negatives, and then more were donated by the studio.
I'm so glad you got them.
Yeah.
Because what a loss it would be if those weren't around, right?
It's a really amazing collection. And I think the reason why our museum loves them so much is that they came with the ledgers. So the ledgers, these books that a photographer, uses to document who purchased the photos.
Sure.
So he has this whole numbering system.
Sure.
And you can tell to the year that a photograph is taken. And we have most of the ledgers. We're missing some of the early ones. But you can actually open it up and find the number and find who purchased the photo.
No different than back in the day when, I came to, the work that I do. I've seen over my 35 years this incredible change in technology and how we film stuff and how we edit and how we distribute that video to TV stations, whatever. And it started with 2-inch tape where there's these huge reels. Then it went to 1-inch tape. You and I were talking about it because you had these awesome 3/4-inch tapes of some content that we just couldn't get because you won't let it out. Then there's nobody in town except Dan Mortimer, I love you, Dan, who has the only 3/4-inch deck that I can remember. Maybe KSBS does. He bought it for my brother who had it, and 3/4 has become obsolete. But it was the staple of running TV ads in every station here. You had 3/4-inch decks all over the place in the 80s and 90s, and then that transitioned to beta and then digital beta, and then it all went digital. It's all now it's all completely digital, and we just send files back and forth. But those old tapes are now, I mean, I have a bunch of them. My brother's got a bunch of them. We should be giving them to you. They're really kind of history. Because I mean, they're all old ads that we did or whatever, but they're a slice of a time, right? And I think we don't think of that, whatever. And we would number all of them. We had to just really be able to find them and go back and catalog them and all that stuff. But now that I think of it, I mean, because I'm so old, but that's exactly what Libby was doing. I mean, it's no different. The thing you do every day becomes at some point valuable. Right.
Well, and in my personal life, one of my favorite documentaries is this documentary called The Black Power Mixtapes, which are done with Swedish archival news footage. News footage from Sweden, of all places.
Is what covered the Black Power
and it's all,
here.
It was B-reels and just
60mm film.
All this film that they just had in their archive. Well, and
look at Get Back, the Beatles documentary. It was the same thing, right?
But that's the whole idea. That's the thing that that I think is really great about collecting this stuff is that we don't look at it in terms of like, gee, this is really important, like, because so-and-so, blah, blah, blah. We look at it in more terms of what does this have on it? What's the content? What does this tell us? And stuff that...
About a time.
Yeah, stuff that people don't expect to be important ends up being really important. Or, you know, as a museum, the MAC is really kind of committed to storytelling. So these personal stories, and usually an object that gets donated usually has archival material that comes with it. So like photographs or letters that kind of tell and build up that story. And I think one of my favorite collections is this collection of letters from, it was actually this collection of materials that this family used to try to get acknowledgement during the reparations for Japanese internment. And his name is Frank Hirata. And he was one of 2 men that were arrested on Pearl Harbor, the evening after Pearl Harbor.
He was living in Hawaii.
He was living in Spokane.
He was living in Spokane.
There was a wedding that just ill-timed wedding within the Japanese community. So on December 7th, there was this wedding. And
fate.
And they detained a bunch of the wedding guests after the wedding, and 2 men were arrested and sent to Department of Justice camps.
Internment camps.
So not internment camps. These are camps that would hold enemy aliens. So people that were, you know, spies for Germany, or prisoners of war.
So was Frank an actual citizen of Japan, or was he?
He was a citizen of the United States. Wow. He'd immigrated over here. Wow. His children were here. Actually helped build. He ran the judo hall here in Spokane. He had several commercial interests downtown. He ran a hotel downtown, and he was the president of the Japanese Growers Association, which was a wholesale grocery co-op, basically. And what's really interesting about these letters, it's all of his letters to his family back home.
Oh, wow, cool.
And so he's writing, like, you know, do really well in school to his daughter who was at Whitworth, and, you know, asking his son to kind of take over the judo classes and make sure those are maintained and make sure they're supporting their mom and keeping the family business. Right. While he's in this Department of Justice camp. And so this is pre-internment for most of the Japanese Americans, and Spokane was outside of the internment zone, so most Spokane Japanese Americans were not interned, except for these 2 men who were put in like a prison camp, and they're denied reparations because it's not internment after the war. And so these are all these letters that are written to the family, and his wife had donated her wedding dress. So we have this beautiful Japanese kimono, and some board games and some newspapers from different internment camps that the family had collected. And it's just this precious like story, this family's story about trauma and hardship. And I always look at that collection and think of like how my job ethically is responsible for that story,
right? And
making sure that that story is told and that it lives and that it's used properly so that people aren't misquoting it or misusing it.
Right. It's got a fair, objective view, right?
And that it's the story lives on, and that people remember it.
Well, that's really cool.
A lot of times we think of things that are difficult and we don't want to remember, and or we disagree with it. I mean, there's definitely parts of this region's history that people would like to forget. But you have to preserve it. You have to save it, because otherwise people will look back and say it didn't exist.
Well, my family experienced that kind of close up, because my dad was an architect in town here for 60 years, and we were left when he passed away. And actually, even before, when, he was like, okay, I kind of got to deal with the fact that I've got blueprints of buildings. He designed 800 buildings through his career, and you've got to store those because he needs to keep them for clients or for future things or whatever. So it's kind of just massive amount of stuff that we had to deal with. And we came up, with the idea, hey, the MAC should have this. Right. Or at least ask them, because what are we going to just throw these away? Which maybe we should, but there's buildings that still exist that they need these plans. In some cases, we went to he did a lot of Catholic churches in town, a lot of work at Gonzaga University. And so we went to each of those individual churches and to the archives at Gonzaga and said, hey, we've got, the original architects to, the Museum of Arts and Culture here, or the Museum of Native American Arts and Culture, that the Monac building that he designed, which is a really different kind of style to this town, and that mid-century modern kind of, little Guggenheim thing, and we had those donated to Gonzaga, and then the rest of them we took to the archives at the MAC, and you guys were great. You took them and you were like, oh, these are great to have, and we're like, they are. We're just like, thank you for getting them out of our
well, and what's
world.
What's fun about that is that most of your dad's buildings are now starting to enter the historic register eligibility.
Oh, wow.
So
I didn't know that.
In Spokane, the city and unincorporated areas of the county, there is this great historic preservation program, and buildings are eligible for the historic register after 50 years from construction.
Wow.
So,
you'd be in there for sure.
We're in the 70s right now. So it's really,
he did stuff 50s, 60s, 50s on. Yeah.
So we're just starting to see people that are like, oh, my house is eligible for the historic register.
Wow.
And what's great about our historic preservation program is that the folks down at the city are just fantastic. Megan and Logan are just amazing, and they really are like, if it is a good example, we'll add it. It's not like some of these other towns where like you have to reach a certain echelon of like prestige.
Fanciness,
yeah, right. But it is very inclusive, and it's like everybody. All styles of architecture, from
whatever kind,
yeah, like storybook, kind of cookie cutter houses, yeah, to
the mansions,
right, and it's really just it's inclusive, and it represents such a wide variety, and we have a really amazing historic preservation program.
It meant a lot to us as a family that would matter, and he'd be honored, and that they could remember it, and that it's safe and somewhere that his really hard work kind of isn't just thrown into the trash,
right?
That's kind of it. Just meant a lot, and the fact that you guys are like, no, we want this. That was really cool.
Well, we have other architectural drawings that we that's kind of a thing that the MAC likes to collect, is architectural drawings. We have the space, and we like to collect those things, but we get contacted all the time about, do you have this architect? And we're like, no. So because
people didn't bring it.
Well, yeah, and there, stuff wasn't under copyright, and so like intellectual property and all of those things weren't really considered.
Right.
And so a lot of times when an architect would retire, they would turn the firm over to somebody else, and so the drawings would stay with the firm, and the firm would change names, and so you'd have to track down all of that information. That's how we ended up with most of the Kirtland Cutter materials, was through.
Well, and the cool part of it is that Kirtland Cutter, Gus Pearson is a guy who worked for Kirtland Cutter, and my dad worked for Gus Pearson. So he was really proud of that, like, lineage. From Cutter to Pearson, who he was, revered old guy
Pearson
when he worked
amazing,
for him. But he did amazing work, and Dad worked for him went right out of college at WSU in the 50s. And then he carried it on to somebody else, and it's just that's like, wow, you're third generation kind of. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, and it's, the amount of times that people come in and are not expecting to find something, and we have a picture of their house.
Right.
And, it's like, oh my gosh. Or like, there's my favorite of these Libby photos of like people who it's their first automobile, and they'll hire Libby to take a picture of them in front of their house with their automobile, and they're like furs. And it's just like, it's 20s. Very much like this, this moment of, I have to document this like momentous
such a
occasion.
Big deal.
Right. And so, we find those photos now, and we're like, hey, look at this amazing photo. And
those are cool.
It's just, that connection, I think, is what's really important, both to donors and then also to researchers.
So my family's been in this town. I just sort of realized that I was thinking about this, like, oh yeah, my grandparents moved here in the 1920s, so it's been 100 years that my family's been in this.
That's amazing.
Region, yeah, it's kind of cool. And I always been kind of fascinated by that as you look through all the stuff that you're at. What were the 20s like in Spokane? What were the 30s like in Spokane? We kind of, I know a little bit of glimpse of that from, Bing Crosby was here in that era, and he did a bunch of stuff. But But I've heard so many stories, and that's kind of what I wanted to get out of you really for this is what's your favorite stories that you've heard through this?
Wow.
And what are the unsolved mysteries? We don't have to take these one at a time, but like, you know, and then I've got a bunch of questions for you just on different eras. But what are the ones that you're like, you know, you told me the great one about the Japanese American. That was a really cool one. What other ones are you, or any mysteries you are like, I can't solve like this?
Mysteries. Well, I think my mysteries are more, how did something get to us? So we have these collections. For a while, I was trying to figure out, we have this like snippet of a Civil War diary, for instance. And we have 2 Civil War diaries in our collections.
Wow.
One's from this, one was actually donated right before the pandemic. And it's this man, Jiro Coons, who...
New to you.
Yes, brand new.
Wow.
I mean, this is the cool thing about my job is that it's a Civil War diary and it comes in 2020. You know, it's been held in families, households. So, you know, there's these kinds of like, how did this get here? And there was this Civil War diary that's a snippet. And... the documentation on the like early museums were the MAC actually is the home of the Eastern Washington State Historical Society's collection. So we're like a state agency that everything we collect for the museum is held in trust for the people of Washington State, and we've been around since 1916. Which means
that they have the right to at least view it or use it or whatever.
Right. Yeah. So it's we're mandated through state law as a historical society to collect and preserve on the history and culture and peoples of Eastern Washington. So it's not just Spokane. But what's really interesting is some of the early collecting that was done. There was this guy, William S. Lewis, who was a lawyer. And I mean, he represented, I think it was the Umatilla tribe. I might be wrong, but I think it was the Umatilla against the federal government. Like he was kind of progressive for his time.
Very.
And he found, I'm not entirely sure how he came across it, but this manuscript about this man who was a Scottish Chinook Indian. His dad was the chief factor, so like the head honcho, the head fur trader at Fort Colville.
Wow.
And he had this like fantastic story that he had written down, and he had edited it, and he had done a couple different revisions to it. And he passed away in the 1890s, 1894. And then somehow William S. Lewis got a hold of it and was like, this can't be true. And the story was about this man who was a sailor and bribes a ship's captain in 1848 to drop him off the coast of Japan, which was closed off from the world, and then pretends that he's shipwrecked. And
he makes up this story.
Well, because in Japan, foreigners in Japan would be met with execution. The only city that foreigners were allowed in Japan was Nagasaki, and he's way far away from Nagasaki.
But Japan, whatever.
Right. Well, and he's found by the indigenous peoples of Japan, the Ainu, and he's basically transferred down to Nagasaki and teaches a bunch of foreign dignitaries. So Japanese dignitaries, which we would consider foreign dignitaries, how to speak English. And those students end up being the main negotiators.
He was an ESL teacher.
Right. And those students end up being the main negotiators when Commodore Perry and Lord Elgin open up Japan, like forcibly make Japan sign a treaty that opens Japan up to trade other than just the Dutch. Wow. And it's this, it radically reshapes
the world.
Yeah. I mean, literally. Japan had not been opened up to trade before that point. Wow. And so, but Randall McDonald was kind of forgotten to history. And William S. Lewis finds this like autobiography and is like, I have to know if this is true. And confirms it with these professors in Japan. And they publish Randall McDonald's story. And this is the first time that Randall McDonald's like autobiography, which he had written to try to publish, actually gets published.
Interesting.
And it's, several years after his death. It's
posthumous for sure.
Yeah. So, and now there's the Friends of Randall McDonald, based out of Oregon. His gravesite in Ferry County is a state park.
Wow.
It's just this really cool legacy. And for
that
me,
was unearthed, right?
Right.
You could find that tomorrow for somebody.
There's so many stories like that. And I think for me, the mysteries are more, what are those stories that are just waiting to be uncovered in the archive? We had one recently that was like the coolest kind of thing for me. I had a full geek out moment. This collection that it just was vaguely described. It was in mining photos, and we opened it up, and it's a collection that was donated by Stacy Coles in 2014. And we opened it up, and I was just going through trying.
Former editor of the Spokane Review.
Yeah.
Publisher.
So
Publisher.
Yeah, he had donated these photos that are we're not entirely sure what year. So the mining troubles that happened in the Coeur d'Alene mine area. So this is like Kellogg, Wallace. There's a bunch of little towns in between, Taft. These like kind of this area of the silver mine, Silver Valleys. Yeah. So there's this period called the Troubles everybody talks about, where this is kind of at the beginning of unionization of these kind of hard labor positions. These are
building a railroad through there,
right? Yeah,
and mining.
And mining. The mining alone, you're literally risking life and limb every time you go into one of those mine shafts, and you're getting paid almost nothing to enrich somebody else. Right. So there's these unions that are starting to like form, and violent clashes happen where they're trying to like stop the unions. And we have lots of material on this period. We have people like Edward Boyce, who is the president for a while of the Western Federation of Miners. He's publishing this very pro-union paper. The Western Federation of Miners become part of the IWW, which is the International Workers of the World, which is, then splits later on from the Western Federation because they're more radical. I mean, they want a whole they have an anarchist political viewpoint and all these things. And this is at a period where anarchists are literally, I mean, they killed the Tsar of Russia. So anarchy is kind of scary. Anyway, there's this these pro-labor workers to get attention and to make their points known, and they'll go on strike. And when that doesn't happen, they resort to violence, like blowing up a smelter. And so we have these, and it happens in 1892 and then 1896 are kind of the two major periods of violence, at least. And these photos are photographs of the black buffalo soldiers that were stationed all over the western United States. And to stop the mining riots, they would bring in these buffalo soldiers instead of regular military to kind of stop. And the buffalo soldiers were kind of treated more like the National Guard. Gotcha. That's kind of where their role was. Right. And their first major call for combat was the Spanish-American wars. But they were kind of posted all over in the Western territories. Many of them were like the children of slaves. Some of them fought in the Civil War. Right. I mean, this is the 1890s. Wow. It's only been 30 years. So we don't have a lot of photographs. We have some. There were some stationed at Fort Wright here in Spokane. We have photographs of Teddy Roosevelt going out and observing the troops. Wow. These are always men. They're cavalrymen. So always on horseback. Yep. And they were always led by a white officer. So we have like a collection of one of the white officers, and so there's photographs in that collection, and then these photographs of Teddy Roosevelt. So we don't have a lot of photographic documentation, and this collection is like pictures of like blown up buildings and Pinkertons, which are these like kind of mercenary detectives. I mean, this is the Wild West.
The Pinkertons, the railroad guys. They were the railroad
so
security.
There's Pinkertons like posing for photos, like with guns pointed and a little mini cannon pointed at the camera, and then there's these photographs that are just amazing of these black servicemen in uniform, striking, like candid photos. And
that's in your collection.
Originals. So we kind of this is what happens when you get collections in. things can kind of, we know we have them. We know we had mining photos, but that significance wasn't really made apparent until we pulled it open.
Led you down a road to something way more interesting and way cooler.
Cool.
So cool.
Yeah, and the thing that I always like to tell people is that, I don't know if you've read Cold Millions by Jess Walters, but this is it's kind of set in it's a fictional account of pretty much the free speech fights, which is IWW, which is the beginning of the IWW height, and this story about the mining troubles is kind of that precursor to the free speech fight, which is the precursor to the Sedition Act and the kind of crackdown of the IWW during World War I. And you can kind of look at these things in kind of long form and just hear the stories, and you'll see a person's name, and then that person shows up and this other thing and that other thing. And
it's like your own Netflix series that you get to follow all the time every day. You just love it. You
have to work really hard to not get sucked down into
the rabbit hole.
Yes, really hard. Sometimes it's impossible, and sometimes we get research requests that are just okay, I have to know. Right. We kind of limit ourselves as to how much we do research for researchers. We try to leave the research to the researchers.
But curiosity, man.
Sometimes we're okay, I just need to know what this is. So
that's so cool.
And that's the fun part, and then connecting people to those stories.
Well, one of the questions that I've always had about this area, you hear all these kind of what you think are urban legends, but you wonder if they're real. So I'm going to tick through some. Okay. And you tell me if these are true. Al Capone's sister was married to Camellini, who owned Camellini's restaurant, basically Italian restaurant and or compound on the Little Spokane River, and that Al Capone would come hide out here.
So I don't know if it's true.
You're the one who should know.
I know, right? Sometimes you don't have evidence, and I'm all about what's the primary source tell you. And a primary source is something that is contemporaneous to the time, right? And usually something written, in firsthand. Newspapers tend to be more secondary because it's usually hearsay, unless it's a direct interview. So I don't know for sure. We do know Camellini's was that estate was involved in Prohibition. Rum running. We do know that.
Okay. That makes sense.
We know that there are, hidden panels and spaces to hide alcohol and booze.
Makes sense.
We know that this is during a time period where people are literally hiring women, usually to drive vehicles up across the Canadian border to get whiskey and drive back down. Yep. Right? And we know that there was a pretty large crackdown. But as to the connection with Al Capone, I am not entirely sure.
Wow.
I do know.
You might want to research that.
I know, right? This is these questions that are just I'm not Wikipedia, but I will find out.
You're not going to sleep tonight.
But I do know,
Bugsy Siegel.
Bugsy Siegel. His one of his longtime girlfriends. She was in Spokane.
Wow.
Her home is raided, and most of the things in the home are seized by the IRS. So we do know other stories about mob kind of connections.
How interesting. Where did she live? Where was this house?
Well, so there's a book called Bugsy's Baby, and that it details all of that in there. But up on the South Hill.
No way. Do you know where? Somebody's living in that house.
Someone's going to have to correct me if I'm wrong. But I feel like it's a Comstock area, but I could be wrong.
Wow. I'm going to have to find out that. That's cool. So she was living there and got raided.
Yes. Yeah.
Crazy.
Yeah. She was out of town and she came
back.
Because
that was always the rumor I always heard. Yeah. The urban legend was that this was the mafia hideout where the heat was on. They send them to Spokane. Nobody's going to expect that they're there. This lazy little town. Go see the Camellini's. Hang out there. Because they had a lot of little cabins and stuff there.
Right. It's a reasonable assumption. I mean, Spokane is a pretty large witness protection city. We have a lot of settlement, resettlement for people in Witsec, and for refugees as well. It's a large enough city that you can get lost in, but it's small enough that it's not on most people's radar.
Right.
And so it makes sense that you would then just jump to, well, obviously the mob was up here too. So, but do we have evidence of that? Yeah.
Well, I'm going to believe it.
So.
Yeah, okay. All right. Frank Sinatra was arrested. This is the story I've heard. Arrested for inappropriate behavior with a minor female in the Fox Theater balcony when he was performing here with the Hoboken Four in the 30s and
So
arrested.
This is pretty specific.
I don't know.
If this happened, if it happened, it would be in the newspapers.
Right.
So, I mean, a really easy answer to this is go to newspapers.com.
Go research it yourself, pal.
Right. Do your own research.
That would be the most important thing you'd be doing at the MAC.
I know I've heard this story before.
Come on.
You
have heard it. See,
yeah,
you've
heard
it too.
before. I just don't know. I can tell you things like so this is fun. Recently at a auction in London, there was a suit that supposedly Bing Crosby wore. But it's dated, like it was constructed and dated to like 1923. So this is pre-Crosby fame. This is before he left Spokane.
Right.
And it's this wool black dinner suit. And unfortunately, the museums, we don't tend to buy things. We were like paying attention to this auction, and we didn't win a bid. But you know, like stuff like that just pops up all the time. And I'm like, why does somebody want to collect something pre-fame?
So my family had my kids, my first wife Tessa, her grandfather was a really famous guy named Dutch Groshoff.
Okay, yeah.
You've heard of Dutch Groshoff?
Yes,
okay, well there you go. So Dutch was a phenomenal banjo player and musician, and he taught music forever at the Music City building, and he would teach all kinds of lessons and stuff. But amazing musician, and he had his own band, at Liberty Lake. There was a bar out there, a nightclub, and he was the weekend music there in the 40s and 50s and 60s, and he was one of Bing's best friends. And the story, you know, the family story that we know to be pretty true, because she told my first wife Tessa that, was that Bing and his brother Bob and another guy, I don't remember his name, were all like, we're getting out of this town in the mid-20s.
So it would have been Al Rinker.
Al Rinker, it was Al. We're going to L.A. And they didn't tell Dutch. They just said they were going to Portland to play a gig, and they go. You know, Dutch had to bring his stuff, so they get to Portland, and they're like, "No, we're not. There's no gig. We're going to L.A. We're going to all be famous." And Dutch was like, "You guys are crazy."
Well,
and let me out, and I'm leaving. And he got out of the car, and he left and came back to Spokane. All three of them went and made it famous. Bing was the most famous man in the world, and Dutch.
Al Rinker's sister, Mildred Bailey, she was a pretty well-known jazz singer.
Oh my gosh!
And she got them their first orchestral gig with Harold Whitehouse's orchestra.
And Dutch was the best of them all, really, in terms of talent. And I mean, Bing's got all the talent, but in terms of playing, I mean, they all played in his band. And Dutch was, and the story goes that Dutch never regretted it a minute in his life. He's like, "You guys are crazy. I don't care. I'm just gonna stay here and hunt and fish and do my thing." And Bing every summer would come home and they would go fish together and hunt. And they were friends their entire lives. Yeah. And they performed they had a big concert to raise money at, for, I think it was at Nat Park, for Joe Albi Stadium. And so we have some. I think Tessa still has some recordings of that concert that you guys should have. and Dutch's famous banjo that Bing signed that you should have. Yeah. So that's the kind of stuff that I think people just kind of have in their house.
Oh yeah.
But that really should be preserved, and you guys would take much better care of. Right?
Well, we do. We have temperature controlled storage with humidity controls and. It's.
I'm working on getting that banjo to you. Let me just put it that way.
Space,
I don't know if I'm going to win this, but it's such a precious thing.
It is, cool. And everybody's family stories are so precious, and
they have it in a really safe place. I'm just saying, it's not just in the attic or something.
I believe you,
but still.
But even then, the Civil War diary we got, recently. It's not in the greatest condition, but we're still, it's a Civil War diary.
Civil War diary.
You're going to take it.
Absolutely.
We're trained to preserve these things, and the goal of an archivist is to preserve things for 1,000 years. Right. I mean, that doesn't sound like a long time. It's a long time. Yeah. It's like a long
1,000 years
time.
Is a long time.
But that's the goal. I mean, 1,000 years ago, William the Conqueror's invading England, so it's a long time.
That's a long time. It's not in perpetuity, but it's getting close.
But and the idea is that as time, hopefully in 1,000 years, people have the technology to preserve things for forever or in perpetuity. But that's the idea. And
so cool.
So, I mean, it's whenever people come into the storage areas or things like that, it's always cold. It smells like a used bookstore, and I always tell people that's the smell of like organic material decomposing. So it's, like that used book smell that we all love.
Well, some of that film you were telling me is ready to blow
Vinegar
up.
syndrome, those kinds of things. And we're working on like transitioning things over. We have all the expo materials right now that we got a really wonderful grant from the Johnston Fix Foundation to help digitize the rare format materials.
Thank God.
Audio and video materials that are like dictabelts. I don't know if people know what a dictabelt is, but it's like plastic ring with grooves like a record. And there's very few places that even know how to play those things anymore. So it's kind of the 20th century is this like period of like rapid technology change.
Crazy.
And
just
that
in
catch-up
my
is amazing.
Life, in my professional life, it's been a crazy chain of how much different technology has changed.
Right. Well, and there's this like we have this collection. Sorry, I just talk about collections all day. We have this collection by this guy Thomas Elsom, who was the first telephone installer in Spokane.
Whoa.
He installs the first telephone in 1884, and I processed his photographs. He bought a camera right on there in the same time for personal use, and then he starts to use it to document like his work. So it's like pictures of them raising telephone poles intermixed with pictures of his wife and their new baby. And it's this
That's what my phone looks like.
It's such a cool collection because for him, he's taking photos of like, look at this cool new telephone pole.
Right.
Okay.
To us, it's like a telephone pole.
It's a piece of wood. But it's this town in the background, this western town of like in 1889. Wow, right. And so you have these pictures of like places that don't exist anymore. So now they have ghost towns, like Mondovi, these kinds of towns that were never really official towns, like old logging towns up on the border with Canada. And it's this really cool collection. And as I'm processing this, I mean, it goes up into the 1920s, and he's retiring, and just the amount of change in that period.
Right.
I mean, the telephone is when suddenly it's instantaneous information. Right. Like prior to that, even a telegram, it's not instantaneous.
You
have to
game.
You had to courier it out somewhere, or you had to wait for somebody to come into the office to get the information. It's faster than a letter. A letter would take, a couple weeks, but especially out west.
It would all drive us crazy if we didn't have that information.
It's amazing how that's
not that long ago, really, if you think about it.
Right. But, my kids have no idea what a landline is.
No, yeah. Let
even
alone a rotary phone.
So my best friend in elementary school
kids
had a rotary phone, and I thought it was the coolest thing ever.
You probably didn't even know what that was.
I wanted to call my parents on that phone all the time because I was like, are you going to turn it? But that technology has completely changed.
Right.
And I think about this because we live in such a digital world now. And I kind of feel like one of the last generations that grew up in a more analog world, like pre-internet in everybody's house.
Right.
And I still fall on some of I have some digital skepticism of things like don't just put everything online and get rid of paper. But I'm also an archivist, and paper's my job, so it's probably also why. But
there's something to that.
But the amount of change and how quickly it's happened is just amazing.
Right. Well, and this makes it this digital world makes it really hard on archivists.
Well, archivists. Well, and it's not just
Snapchat.
Right. How do you archive those things? Well, and it's not even just that. Like, we used to make newspaper clippings, like clip stuff out of the newspapers, and we still do clip stuff out of newspapers. But say it's something that's like the information's been updated on the website. It's not in a printable format. Right. You can't. It used to be you could like click and print this, and it would create a printable version. They don't do that now in most of these newspapers. Whoa. So I always think of like those things of like so, and there's groups like archive.org that are archiving the internet. They send out crawlers that like snapshot. Check out the Wayback Machine. You can get like Yahoo in like the 90s, and it's pretty awesome. You get lost on that site.
I'm gonna check that out.
But a lot of archivists talk about how digital is so transient. like the impermanence of digital, like things can get corrupted so easily, but also how much we generate. I look at my Gmail account, and there's like 1,900 emails in there.
Oh yeah, I got more than that. Yeah.
You know, and I look at it. Well, and that's me cleaning and deleting things. I don't. But that's the thing, right?
Maybe.
Most people don't do that anymore.
Maybe I'm doing it for you. People give me crap about how big my inbox is. I'm like, this is just for Anna.
But that's the thing is what do you do with those emails in the future? We're going to have too much information.
Well, we already do.
People don't save. People save everything, not just the important things.
Yeah. Norm Macdonald had that great joke about it. It's like, I saw a picture of my great grandfather the other day. The picture of my great grandfather the other day,
right?
And someday my kids are gonna go, "Hey, you want to see 100,000 pictures of your grandfather?" Right? I mean, it's just ridiculous about. So this podcast is called "The Most Interesting Person You've Never Heard of." Who's the most interesting person that we've never heard of that you've come across in your time there? Maybe you've already said it. Maybe it's that.
Well, I can think of a couple. I'm trying to think. So I'll tell you, I'm going to break these into 3 kinds of interests. So there's the most interesting person that I want to know more about.
I like it.
So we
that
have...
qualifies. Bing!
Right.
You may continue.
Make a sound effect. There's this collection of letters. There's not a lot of them. I think it's 4, by a prostitute at the turn of the century, so around 1900, to her boyfriend in Seattle about her clients.
Whoa!
Yeah.
No way.
I really want to know more about Abby.
Abby is her name.
I want to know so much.
Wow.
So, that's one where it's like, I can go on Ancestry and go look at the census and try to find information out.
But the stories about her clients must be really interesting.
So you get this little snippet into her world.
Wow.
So that's one.
I like that. Abby wins. Okay,
so
far.
So that's one. I would also say, I think probably one of the most interesting people that people have forgotten about is actually it's one of the most regularly asked for collections in the archive. And what people want to see is what we don't have. Eric Johnston. So, Johnson Vicks Foundation. Eric Johnston was the president of the Chamber of Commerce during World War II. He's kind of heavily responsible for kind of helping keep the U.S. economy afloat during the war.
Wow.
He then moves on to the Motion Picture Association after the war and is the president of the Motion Picture Association during the McCarthy era, so the blacklist.
Wow,
blacklist. And he has to balance the demands of politics with protecting the industry because the industry is really at threat at this point.
Oh, absolutely. It is. Charlie Chaplin and a
artists,
lot of people that were.
And the actors and artists were not really helping the cause, of trying to keep the waters calm. They're literally in there splashing it up.
Oh yeah, for sure.
And so, he kind of, people know him as the guy who created the blacklist, which is not true.
He was just overseeing the entity that where that time happened.
And the reason I find him so interesting is because that is not what people should know him for. He was a diplomat. He was heavily involved in these diplomatic missions or the Jordan Water Project. Wow. He goes to Russia, so the Soviet Union, multiple times and kind of on behalf of the U.S. government. Wow. And, this guy
the most
his
interesting
speeches,
man in the world.
Yeah, you're just this guy.
Did he drink Dos Equis? I bet.
Oh, I have no idea. I have no idea. But he literally is one of those people you he's there for all of these of crucial things, but he's not the central figure in these things, and he's just really interesting.
Wow.
And
you got a front seat.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And he was from Spokane.
He's from Spokane?
Yeah, he was from Spokane
No way.
kind of was self-made.
When was Johnston in Spokane? When was he born here?
So he was.
And what high school did he go to? No, that's what you say.
That's a good question.
From Spokane.
He was born in 1886. He's in Spokane. Early 1900s. He moves with his mom, and his parents get divorced. He didn't have a great family, home life, and that affected him a lot. But he was self-made. He went to WSU.
Oh, he did.
For college, and graduated right before World War I. Served in World War I. Just interesting life.
And then stayed and gave back.
Yeah,
well, that's really cool.
And, there's lots of stories like that of these people in Spokane that are kind of self-made. And
a lot of them.
Well, yeah, and the amount of political movers and shakers that came from Spokane.
Oh, Tom Foley.
And Tom Foley's part of this lineage.
He went to high school with my dad.
Yeah,
they were classmates. They skied together in high school.
There you go. But that is that idea of like this has been a region for political and economic and social power.
Absolutely.
It's not been an area that, kind of is like, we love to think of Spokane as like that lazy Western town that nobody remembers, but
big stuff happened here.
Yeah, and produced pretty influential people.
Wow. That's cool.
So that is the person that I would say
that's a great answer.
That I think people should know more about.
They should know about that guy.
Yeah, and then I have one more answer, and this is more personal inquiry. I would love to know. I think they're the early curators that started the Historical Society back in 1916. You have this guy Thomas Bonser, who was the first curator, and William S. Lewis, who was the secretary, the corresponding secretary. Literally, his job was to write to people about like historical inquiry. And Bonser was a high school science teacher. He taught botany and like geology at North Central. And it's like, I want to know you. I want to know.
Because he does your job.
Well, and he is part of this group of like teachers from this area. They all call themselves professors because at the time high school was kind of like college.
Well, my dad went to Gonzaga High School, which was on the campus of Gonzaga University, so it was like you just were in absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
So these guys are all professors at these high schools around the 19-teens, and I just Bonser was in with this group of guys who they get Harlan Brett's the Ice Age flood theory scientist to come out and like take a look at the stuff that they're having their high school students go do. Like they're having high school students go take geological samples, and they're writing papers that then Brett cites in his Ice Age flood theory.
Wow.
So it's just interesting. Like these people that are just kind of lost to history. I did this in grad school. I did this project with a couple other grad students, especially Frank Osterheld, who works at the Washington State Archives. But we developed a walking tour of ghost signs, which are these old advertising. Like they're like the faded like the signage on the top of the right?
5 cents on the side of the building.
Or like clean rooms.
You guys had a tour, right?
Yeah.
So we went on that. I thought that was such a cool thing. Like,
yeah, Frank and I built this tour up, and then I can kind of continued it on through the MAC, and so there's all of these like names that you're just like, who is that person?
Right.
And they're just like Dana Childs, for instance. There's this one sign that says like Childs Brothers and Day, and like Dana Childs and his brother Dana ends up being like the Postmaster General under Wilson. Like these people are just kind of
major people.
Yeah, and it's one of those things of there's so much to discover. We like to tell the same stories about Spokane. We always talk about, the hidden tunnels under the Davenport being
that was one of my questions too.
I don't think those were for rum running. They might have stored some
alcohol
down there.
Used for rum running.
But there were steam channels all over.
Nobody made a tunnel for that. But there were tunnels that people took advantage of.
But the steam plant was still using them during the time before. I wouldn't be down there when there's hot steam.
Because that was one of my wife's questions. She's like, Travo's used to be this great restaurant on the kitty corner of right across the street from the Davenport. Right. And there were, her first husband worked there, and there's a tunnel under there that goes right in. I know the Luso has tunnels right across the street. And
some of those could have been...
It was a whorehouse back in the day. And so, hey,
did
the guys go underneath?
I think we're more for...
Even Spaghetti Factory has like these big,
But most of those would be more so for like things like, especially under hotels, would be for if the same hotelier owned 2 buildings
right.
across the street from each other.
Okay.
You can transport laundry, staff, and all of those things
which
underground.
is actually true today of the Davenport and Luso.
Yeah, there you go.
They are owned by the same place.
But we do know that there were some speakeasies. Most of the speakeasies, and we know this just because of investigative records. So there's a lot of investigation records that really target around Trent Alley, which was the international district, had a lot of
opium dens and stuff.
Yeah,
right?
And
Chinese. There's a big
Chinese. It was mostly owned by
where
pool
was
halls.
That? Where was that?
So Trent Alley, you know where Atticus is?
Yeah.
And Atticus has a speakeasy in the basement.
Yes.
They're one of the
Yes.
few that actually has a speakeasy.
Yes.
So Atticus and like where the Steelhead is, that alley next to the Steelhead,
sure.
that's Trent Alley.
Really?
And it ran all the way over to Division. So like, and you can see it in other parts, like behind the
for sure.
like
It's there.
FedEx and like where Azteca used to be, like it's right there.
Yes.
Like the public school buildings
Right.
right there. We know that. I say we, like, I'm some authority.
Well, you kind of are.
They did archaeological digs when, minor archaeological digs when they were building the Davenport Grand, and found all kinds of materials.
Oh, wow.
We have at the museum.
Because that was where sort of Chinatown was, or that.
Yeah, and it wasn't,
area, right?
and
I heard
it
that was
wasn't.
where where the carousel would be today. From part of that.
So where the wagon is actually, so where the red wagon is and the carousel, so like, and the rotary fountain, where the rotary fountain is where City Hall used to be. And then like next to City Hall was like the stables, and there was the jail, and there were all of these Oriental laundries, Chinese imported goods, and Japanese, a lot of Japanese imported materials. It's important to remember that Chinese were not allowed into the United States after 1882. So the Chinese Exclusion Act happens. So the Wild West, that period of time with a lot of Chinese immigration, those Chinese workers were replaced by Japanese workers who were seen as more...
this is 30s, 20s, 30s?
I would say 19-aughts.
Okay.
1890s, 19-aughts. You got to remember, Japan just opened up to the world a couple, 50 years earlier. And Japan took an opposite approach of what China did. They adapted an Western culture for their own ends. I mean, the attitude was, we look Western on the outside and we retain our Japanese identity. So a lot of Japanese-owned businesses looked very much like any other business in town. Japanese immigrants in this area were early adopters of technology. There's this really cool photographer, Frank Matsura, who is up in Okanagan country, and he's an early territorial photographer, and he's photographing on Indian reservations.
Wow.
Cool. So there's these Japanese immigrants who bring over their own irrigation technologies and make Yakima Valley into a fertile orchard.
Oh my gosh. The Japanese helped create that. No way.
Yes, yeah.
Which is now like the most fertile hops.
Yes, yeah.
Most of the beer in the world comes from those hops, honestly.
Thanks to Japanese innovation.
No way.
And so you have these these immigration stories, and by the 1930s, the hostility that Chinese immigrants had experienced 30, 40 years earlier is now targeted against Japanese. I mean, there are these anti-Japanese leagues that are popping up all over. Most of the agricultural, farming communities, especially in California, are driving Japanese farmhands off of farms. Wow. It happens in Washington State. It happens in Oregon. It's actually part of the reason and rationale behind why Japanese Americans were interned. Which is just hostility towards Asians in general.
The very good architect in this town, friend of my dad's Ron Tan. I don't know if you know Ron, but he was interned in one of the in that as part of that, and was a very dear friend of my dad's for years, and told them a ton of stories about that.
Oh,
and
yeah.
It was a kid, but it was really scary.
Yeah, absolutely. And these are U.S. citizens.
And a phenomenal architect who did just amazing work in this town.
There's all kinds of archival research that's been done on, the documentation justifying these internment camps and things like that. And there were very few reports that were like, Japanese Americans with Japanese ancestry are likely to, blow up a building. Like there was like nothing like
No.
that, right? There was almost nothing, but somehow
that rumor got started, or
the
danger of
and
that,
the
fear.
J. Edgar Hoover, of FBI fame,
Yep.
his brother was in charge of the agency that oversaw internment. So right there, you have a conflict of interest. But, there were much more credible threats.
Anyone?
Well, and there were much more credible threats of Americans of other European Axis allyship, that are much more likely to commit atrocities on U.S. soil.
Yeah.
The German Americans and Italian Americans. Right.
So they get the slack.
And there hasn't been years of campaigning against a certain ethnic group that is also barred from coming into the United States.
Right.
So it's very racially motivated.
Wow.
And but we have all these really interesting collections that
kind
of tap on that.
The other stuff that we just kept coming across when we were doing our research there was just a natatorium park, which is to me just. Yeah. I wish I'm just a little too young to have experienced that. My brother Jim remembers it in the early 60s.
Right before it closed.
Right before it closed. He was born in 62 and he remembers riding on some rides there, and he remembers it fondly. But I go down there and now it's an RV park basically. Right. And such a beautiful piece of property, because I've always felt like one of the challenges of Spokane, we have the biggest resource we have is this incredible river, and there's really no access to it. Yeah. It's rare, kind of rare access to that. And that place was right on the water, and it was right on the river.
And it connected right to Riverside State Park.
Yeah, and it was just a magical place, and it's, to me, always been sad that it's not still there.
Well, it's one thing I did not know about Nat Park until I had started digging into it a little bit more in depth was that it was started by Washington Water Power Company.
That I didn't. Yeah, you told me that when we were there. I was like, it was?
Yeah, and then they were like, we're a utilities company and we really need to get out of the amusement park game, and that's how
I think it was part of showing off the ability that they had.
Yeah.
It was like a hey, look what we can do, right? Which maybe made sense for a few years, and then after
totally
that, why are we running this?
Yeah,
it was a huge. So just so people don't know, a huge amusement park.
Very big amusement
park. I mean, it had
park.
The Spokane Indians had a baseball field there. It had I want to say a 3,000. A concert hall, a dance hall.
They had a dance hall.
That's where Bing played, I think.
The trolley line would literally end there.
Yes, so the great story about that is
picnic.
My dad, when he was 10, the last trolley car drove from Nat Park, basically the end of Boone Street, all the way to Gonzaga. And he was 10, and my grandfather said, I want you to get on this so that you can say that you rode the last car.
Yeah,
and I'll pick you up there. And he got in his car and left my dad on the train on the trolley car by himself, and then he took off and met him at Gonzaga.
Oh yeah.
And picked him up, and my dad always remembered, I was on the last train ride.
They burned most of those trolley cars.
Which is such
photos
a shame.
Of that. It's just
and now people want to bring light rail back.
Yeah, but again, it's that modernization and adaptation to new technology.
Right.
But it's kind of with Nat Park, it's one of those things of everybody who had been there has a memory of Nat Park.
Yeah, I loved it.
And it's just got this long-reaching history.
Right.
The Loaf Carousel, which is down at Riverfront Park now, that used to be at Nat Park. That was a wedding present to the owners that bought it from it was their family. It was a wedding present in their family.
Wow.
And then they donated it to the city, which then now it has this big, beautiful climate controlled building, but the building it used to be in was the German beer pavilion.
It was the beer hall from
Expo. It was built and designed to house this carousel after the fair, so it was designed with intention.
All right.
But yeah, it was the beer
But
hall.
the one that's in now is way better.
So much better. Because they constantly the conservation efforts on that
just
alone.
preserving that amazing piece of just treasure. What a treasure. Yeah, that is such a I don't know. I was sort of fond of that. One of the things I did earlier today is I said, hey, kind of pushed out on social media. It's anybody got a question for the person who the know-it-all in Spokane. Spokane's know-it-all.
Yes.
That's what you are.
There you go.
And so my friend Stephanie Van Diest, she's amazing. She's a hula hooper and just incredible. So I'm going to read you verbatim what she said.
All right.
See if you can answer this. Ready?
Okay.
Here goes. Okay. I'd love to know the history of the stone structure, and I think I even know. I'm going to guess and see if I know the answer to this. The history of the stone structure and fireplace on the river near the Veterans Memorial Trailhead in Riverside State Park.
Okay, yeah.
Okay. I'd also be super curious about the community that lived in Lower Crossing before the Great Fire, and if the fire did in fact burn down all the houses in the area that is now Herbert Hamlin Conservation Area, which is right across the street, right across the river from Peaceville Valley. Am I right about the Glover Field, right? Thanks. Excited to listen to a Spokane historian. I love learning about this magical place. So I think the first
question
the
is the fireplace and the trail.
Fireplace. I think that was part of the Civilian Conservation Corps in the 1930s.
Ding, ding, ding.
Ding, ding, ding. Which I've been talking about a little bit, but I believe we should reinstate in this country.
It was a great
because it
program.
was a 2-year program, at least of during the 30s and the Depression, if people don't know, everybody was out of work. So the New Deal and Roosevelt said, hey, we're going to put everybody to work. We're going to pay you, and we'll give you some chance to go to college and all kinds of stuff. But you're going to work for 2 years, and you're going to build the national parks. You're going to build the state parks anyway.
Yep.
So they built, there was a bunch of people who were dropped in. They built this place, which was kind of the headquarters and bunkhouse that held them. And they built Riverside State Park. Am I right?
Yes. Yeah.
Unbelievable.
So Riverside State Park kind of has a little bit of a longer history than even that, in the sense that we, as a city,
such a beautiful place.
Yeah, we as a city were part of, we had always advertised ourselves. I mean, like in the 1880s, we were advertising as like the near nature, near perfect kind of motto, right? Like this is something that had been advertised since the get-go.
It's true.
I mean, Spokane was designed as a city that is surrounded by natural resource. And so, this idea of nature being part and infused into the city. And so we actually hired the Olmsted brothers, who were these architects and landscape designers, who were the sons of the famous Olmsted of Central Park fame.
In New York, correct.
In New York. And so these Olmsted brothers come out to Spokane and they do a big survey and they do these recommendations for parks. One of the recommendations becomes Riverside State Park. A park that's, mostly just reserved wildlife, like wildland.
With a few trails.
With a few trails along the river.
Well, and the bold picture right there, just stunning.
Right.
I mean.
Yeah, so that had always been a site that people would photograph stuff at. We have these amazing photos with the bowl and pitcher, and like women in Victorian dress standing on the top of big basalt columns. You're just like, oh, please don't fall. Knowing the shoes you're wearing, and so that's kind of where this idea comes from. And then by the time it becomes a state park. The Civilian Conservation Corps, one of the things that they were doing is it was actually mostly young men. So men that wouldn't be able to find work because there's people that are much more skilled also looking for work, and there's just no way. Right. But it
gave them skill.
Right. And so and it was some camps, there's lots of research on this, and some of the Civilian Conservation Corps camps were segregated, some weren't. It just really depends on the area where. We in Washington State had a lot of them. And part of that has to do with like the political workings of people like C.C. Dill, who was this senator who's really should be credited with getting FDR to sign off on the Cooley Dam project.
Well, and this was pretty rugged territory then. It needed some help.
So logging, a lot of the CCC workers would do logging projects.
Sure.
So get lumber, get all the stuff that then they could go send to sawmills so we can continue to build and grow. And highway infrastructure, it's kind of like the Army Corps of Engineers.
Correct.
That is also involved with this. They would supervise these workers to do these kinds of projects.
So that building that she asked about, what was that?
It should have been. It was built when they built it, and they had these spots with cabins that are there. Those were built for
the workers lived there.
And then they were built, they were intended for people to then rent and use for leisure later on. And so the fireplace is part of a leisure, it's a leisure site.
Oh, wow, cool. And honestly, kind of as you think about it, I always thought like this was a precursor for, getting an army ready for war.
Right.
I mean, right? Like World War II is kind of going on early there. Some of these guys are like, hey, we're training these guys
and
who
it's
will
also,
eventually fight.
Right, and it's also it's a precursor. It's a follow up to the precursor of World War One. A lot of men from this area served in the Forestry Corps in World War One. So literally, you work as a lumberjack in Washington State, and you get enlisted, and you go over and you work over as a lumberjack and build roads and bridges for the U.S. Army in France.
Right.
That's a lot of military presence. Yeah. And we, if somebody is a World War I history buff, please come to the MAC and talk with me, because we have so much World War I materials that I would love people to know about.
It's such a cool era. I mean, I made a movie. It's right there. It was all set during about kind of World War I. The Basket was a movie, and we did a ton of research on that era, and I was just fascinated by that time. It was set in 1914, which is one of the World Wars, or 18, something like that. And it's a really fascinating.
There's a collection we have at the MAC by Gertrude McKernan, who was a Red Cross nurse. She gets a Presidential Medal of Honor by the President of France for fighting the pandemic, the flu pandemic during World War I.
Yes.
But
Influenza.
as part of her uniform, she gets a gun. She's issued a gun as part of her uniform to serve in France as part of the Red Cross. Yes, the Red Cross. She's a Red Cross nurse, and we have her letters to her to family back home here in Spokane. We have stuff from a Dr. Lambert, who served in the chemical warfare division, including some.
I wonder. I know some Lamberts here who's a doctor. I wonder if it's a relative. Could be. Possibly.
I don't know for certain,
but surprised.
Tons of stuff like that.
So the other question she asked is, the community. Super curious about the community that lived in Lower Crossing before the Great Fire, and if the fire did in fact burn down all the houses in the area that is now Herbert Hamlin Conservation, which is a really cool space,
right?
And not used a lot. And I'm like, why don't we take advantage of that better? That should be more of a cool spot, anyway.
So the fire, there's actually pretty good documentation of the burn radius. It didn't jump the river, and it didn't. So the fire,
how was it started? This is like the Chicago
There's a lot
fire.
Of myths.
I know.
And most
That's
of them
why you're
are not
on here.
True. No, a prostitute didn't kick over an oil lamp or let her curling iron get too hot. There was a woman named Irish Kate who gets kind of blamed for the fire. She kills herself. She drinks carbolic acid and kills herself a couple years later.
Because people thought she started the fire?
I don't know if it was because of starting the fire, but it's one of those things of like, please just don't relate a person that we don't have any evidence of starting the fire to
being the one
just
that
because
did.
she's dead. She can't really fight for herself anymore.
Yeah.
So we don't have any evidence of that. I hear that a lot, that it's a prostitute started the fire. What year
was this? This was
1889.
1889. Okay.
Yeah. So this is the year of statehood. It's like pre-statehood.
Yep.
Statehood happens in November of 1889.
Yep.
So this is like still territorial period. Right. And we're not the only fire. This is also when the Seattle fire happens. When the fire in Ellensburg happens.
Right.
Cheney has a fire. There's arsons going on in Vancouver and Olympia. It was the year of the fire.
Wow. Well, that's something we all are used to now.
Yeah. But we have eyewitness accounts. So you know where it's the parking lot next to the train tracks, behind like Nito Burrito.
Yeah. Okay.
Like,
yeah.
You know where the Davenport Hotel is. It's like that parking lot right next to the train tracks. That is Railroad Alley.
Yep.
And
I used to have an office right on Railroad Alley.
And we have this eyewitness who said, I was standing at the freight depot, which used to be right there, standing at the freight depot, and he watched the fire break out.
By Nito Burrito.
Right in that area. So Lincoln and Post. So between that block of Lincoln and Coast.
Right on Lincoln and Railroad Avenue.
Yeah, so Lincoln and Post.
Wow.
And Railroad Avenue between there.
That's where it started.
And and he basically pinpoints it to there's these two kind of cookhouse lodges And he says it happened, like he points to Wolf's Lodge, which was this cookhouse. It had lodgings upstairs. So, you know, and he says that's where it started. And he was right across the street watching them try to put the fire out. And
which is where the Davenport would be now, basically.
Right. So what we know is
was the railroad was there then.
Yeah, the railroad was there.
The
The tracks were on the ground.
On the ground, not above.
Yeah, they were on the ground. They were raised in the 19-teens.
Wow.
But we know that we had a state-of-the-art pump system. So we had like fire hoses, like fire hydrants, right? It was a state-of-the-art system. We were actually kind of known for it. And we had a volunteer firefighter unit. It's like the first major fire. They'd used it a couple times before. It's the first major fire that they're going to use it on. And they crank open the thing, and it's like a garden hose.
Oh.
And
no water
so
came out.
There was like very little pressure.
Oh.
It wasn't enough water or like pressure to break a window. So they actually the account.
It's not like we don't have a huge raging river just like 100
right.
yards away.
Well, and that's the whole thing is that's what was using. That was where we were building it, and the pump house is going. We have pressure. We have pressure. We have pressure. And they're not getting pressure up there. So it's
something got stuck in the.
So the story went in the newspaper. So this gets printed, which then people believe again, right? This is
an early account that ends
an early
up sticking.
account that the superintendent of the waterworks was on an unsanctioned fishing trip, which is not true.
No.
The city hall records. So if you go into the city council meeting minutes, they're like, no, like they fire him. Because they believe this account, right?
The newspaper said it.
And so then they investigate it and they reinstate him because he had a sanction, like it was an authorized vacation, and the person that was left in charge was competent. And the investigation shows that there had to have been a valve somewhere left open along the line.
It was just draining out there.
And it was
never got there.
Yeah, just the pressure was completely released because they were getting pressure down at the pump house. So, you know, and then the other myth that you hear about the fire is that we were a wooden city. And
right.
So where the Davenport Tower is was
Yes.
a place called the Pacific Hotel, which is the first brick building that burns in the fire.
It's a brick building that
burns.
Wow.
In the fire. You have to think about this in terms of construction. So you have lath and plaster.
Right.
So it's all wood with like a concrete over it.
Right.
And this fire is so hot. The conditions for this fire is so hot that it's
burns.
jumping from the top of building to the top of building. And so you're getting heat. So what's it doing? It's creating heat, which then combusts the curtains or something in these brick buildings, which then burn from the inside out.
Inside out.
And so most of the photos we have, and the MAC has a really large collection of these fire photos.
Cool.
So there's this rubble, but it's not wood buildings. It is
brick
and marble and granite buildings.
Whoa.
So
we lost some beautiful buildings.
Yeah, we lost our first skyscraper. We lost, which was like more than, I think it was like 7 stories or something.
Skyscraper.
But it was
Let's
like
go.
the first skyscraper. Well, and at the time with the technology,
Technically
they
it
didn't
was.
have steel trusses at this point. So yeah, like totally, you could totally see that. But what else they tried to do is because the water's not working and they're just like throwing ideas, like, I mean, they're throwing spaghetti at a wall and seeing what sticks. They decided to blow up some buildings to create like a fire line, you know, like you do with a forest fire, right?
Did it work?
No, just exposed timber.
Oh, shit.
And because it's a really hot, muggy night and the wind is blowing.
Oh, I'm sure.
It blows.
Yeah.
Basically, it
Was
doesn't.
it August?
It was in August.
It
August
feels
4th.
like now, yeah.
August 4th. And it blows it all the way down to the river. And so it
Wow,
blows
that's a
all the way
ways.
down to like Havermere Island, pretty much.
Whoa.
And it just burns.
then
But
just
it
stops at the
didn't.
river.
But it didn't go further west.
Didn't jump it.
So
didn't go west.
Lincoln Street is really the line.
Really?
Because Monroe Street, you know where the Review Tower is?
Yes.
That used to be the Crescent department store next to the Review Tower. And next to the Review Tower was also where the jail was at the time.
Wow.
And the police department. None of that burns.
Really?
And the Crescent department store opens up on August 5th. That was their grand opening day. They had scheduled this day.
No, so not the Crescent that I grew up with was
it's the
more
same.
downtown.
Yeah. They moved.
They moved, but it's the
downtown.
same, right? Yeah.
But you know where the Review building was, and so they open. and sell out within hours.
I bet they do.
And
Boy, talk about maybe they started the fire.
Yeah. So, but they didn't really, it was really, the fire was really located to this downtown core. It didn't jump the river. It didn't, so yeah.
It's just such a, it's just such a cool.
But there were so many fires that happened in this time.
Well, I mean, out of it came Louis Davenport and the Davenport Hotel.
And Kirtland Cutter quits his clerking job. He decides to be full-time architect.
Wow. So it spurred some things. Anybody die? I'm sure people must have
So there was a man who jumped out of a building and and I think 3-story skyscraper. And we think he died. But there's some erroneous reports that saying like 2 people died, but as
not
far
really
as we know,
a lot of deaths. Wow.
It was, and he was more from succumbing to injuries from jumping out of a building that he probably could have walked down. That's funny. We have some letters that we got in 2016 from a family who he was visiting Spokane as a potential site for a business, and Charles P. Ouden, and he's staying at a hotel that he's packing up his things because he hears about this fire outside, and this is what he's writing to his wife in Tacoma a couple days later. And he's packing up his stuff, and as he's leaving his hotel, it catches on fire.
Whoa.
And so then he leaves to go stay with a friend, and then he catches a train out of town the next day, and he's writing from Tacoma, which was his next stop on his
So this is his account of what happened.
Right. And so he's writing to his wife, and he has these amazing Kodak pictures that are round. They're like these little circle photos. They're just like such a unique, because photography was new, so like this new technology.
It was his iPhone.
Yeah, I mean, they're just like a circle. They're really, really cool. Like really cool. Of the fire. And then this letter that he's writing from Tacoma, being like really shaken up, and I'm really like, I'm okay, and this is what happened. But what's really fun about him is, so he sets up a business in Tacoma. He had gone from Tacoma to San Francisco, and then decides to set his business up in Tacoma, then moves to Spokane a couple years later and starts American Fire Brick Company.
No way.
Which is just
dripping with irony.
I love it.
I think that's so cool. That's the stuff that you get to,
like, yes.
So a couple of, I know we're going forever. I could talk to you forever.
Fine.
There's a million things. Sundance Kid. Mm-hmm. Did he die here?
That's the rumor. Again, no evidence.
Okay, so you can't prove or
it's
deny.
The rumor. You can't prove or deny.
Why would somebody come up with that? I mean, there must be some truth to it.
Well, there's a guy, Mayor Great Hutton, who's like kind of credited in Spokane as being the first woman to register to vote, and she's like this big suffragist here in town.
The first woman in Spokane, or first woman
to vote? Spokane. Spokane.
Okay, cool.
She like is very involved in the suffrage movement,
sure,
and just gets suffrage in Washington State, and
Got it.
she's friends with people like William Jennings Bryan and like these like populist politicians. She's prior to her time in Spokane, she was really labor oriented, and she wrote this book about the mining troubles that we had talked about earlier. It's called The Coeur d'Alene's A Modern Inquisition. It's a very dramatic title. Her husband was the train conductor who was held at gunpoint by these pro-union strikers to drive the train full of dynamite that blows up Bunker Hill Mine.
No way.
And he's held in this bullpen, and they're like horribly treated. And she just it makes May so upset. After her death, her husband creates the Hutton Settlement, which is this amazing orphan.
That's who May Hutton is. Sure.
Yeah. So anyway,
the Hutton building downtown.
Right.
I've been, when they remodeled it, I saw that their home was in there. They lived in there. It was a beautiful place.
So, but she in her book thinly changes people's names. You can figure out who these people are, and she talks about this one person who claimed that he was the real inspiration for Huckleberry Finn, or for Tom Sawyer, and true enough, there was a guy. And they talk about him in the newspapers who knew, he grew up, in the same area as Mark Twain's writing all this stuff, and he knew him.
Interesting.
And
so he might have been the inspiration for that book.
He claimed he was.
Wow. I like that story.
So there are other stories like that,
like
and
urban legend myths,
which is again why I'm like, I don't have evidence, but it could have happened, but I don't know.
I always wanted to know that. So
and there are people that have looked into it before.
So Zach was asking our producer on this. He has a building, his little studios in Hilliard, and he's really fascinated with Hilliard and that, and also it's right next to the Masonic Temple that was there. There's a Masonic Temple on on Garland. They're kind of spread out all over town. What do we know about the Masons? You got any juicy stories there? Because that Masonic Temple, and I mean, we filmed part of our movie The Basket there. It's just a treasure. What an amazing. So the architecture in those buildings is phenomenal.
Oh yeah. Well, so did you know that the downtown, so the main Masonic,
the
temple that we have downtown, it's really big and long, right?
Yes.
It's like half that size when it's first built, and they build an addition.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
No
it's
idea.
like panoramic of like when it first opens, and it's like half the size, and I was like, wait a second, and like I actually like
because it does appear to be different buildings.
Yeah, it does appear
that way. But when you're inside, I can see that.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah.
So we at the MAC actually, this is I think one of our strengths in the archival collections is we have a lot of secret society records. Not just the Masonic Temple, but like the Independent Order of Odd Fellows.
Yeah, the Odd Fellows, the Knights of Pythias.
The Independent Order of Redmond.
Do you know those guys?
I don't have anything from the
Knights of Pythias. They were right across the street where the NAC architecture is right now. That was I remember going there. My grandfather was a member of that. It was like the Catholic alternative to the Masons.
Yeah.
And that whole building was their hall. And we went to a super like outdated, really kind of old Christmas party that was creeping us out in that building in the 70s. And I mean, no one would even know who those guys are, but the lodges were huge as part of
huge part of social society. And so like things like the Libby collection has photographs of the members.
I bet they do.
And then, we have these collections that some of them like have the code book. So it's like, you look at some of these like Masons had a language, like a code language that they would write in.
Right.
So like the membership manual is in like code.
Why is that?
Because it's a secret society. I don't know.
We don't know.
There's different levels within the Masons.
There's a lot of theories about that.
There's different levels of membership within the Masons,
right,
and so
right.
There's levels of knowledge just like anything else. But it's interesting. Some of the stuff that we have that I think is amazing that we have, and I'm really glad we have it. But also like, is we have the KKK papers from the Montana chapters of the KKK. Whoa. There's lots of correspondence between like Spokane KKK members and Montana.
Is that right? Mm-hmm. So there was a KKK.
Oh yes.
Here.
Oh yes.
I bet
names of individuals. Yes.
Yeah. Yes. Some would say still is.
Yeah.
Wow.
So again, going back to that whole thing of sometimes we collect stuff that's difficult or we pretend it doesn't exist. It's important.
It is important.
It's so important
to document that and stuff.
It's just one of those things of like, I mean, it's from Montana, which is kind of interesting to have here in Spokane, but it is saved.
Wow.
And we do have the collection.
The other thing is, it's actually like, it just always appears there was a ton of bank robberies here.
Mm-hmm.
Is that true?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then the last question would be just about Hilliard and what treasures you might know there.
So bank robberies, there's lots of crime. And white collar crime. There's lots of forgery. So people who are pretending to be other people and like writing bad checks, like that kind of stuff.
Yeah, people disappear in this town. Yeah.
Well, and especially before the internet and before like photography, like photo ID and things like that, you could pretend to be somebody.
Sure.
And those were pretty hefty sentences, like 16 years for like forgery. So yeah, I mean, white collar crime was pretty big, and then like burglaries and stuff like that. Yeah, oh yeah. I mean, security's totally different now.
And Hilliard.
So that's interesting.
There's a lot of stuff there, man. That's such a cool. It's the next spot, I think.
Yeah.
Kind of
so like
gentrifying.
JP Hill, who is like the railroad magnate. Yeah, Jim Hill. So you got the guy that's. Well, JP Hill, he's Great Northern Railroad.
Right.
So now it's the Northern Burlington.
Right.
It's
Northern Pacific as well.
Yeah, Northern Pacific.
My grandfather worked for the NP.
Yeah, they all kind of consolidate over time. Yeah. But he builds this railroad, and he does not want it to be in Spokane. So Hilliard is literally Hill's yard. It was where he started the rail depot for the Great Northern. It was in Hilliard. Hill's yard. That's where that comes from.
His town.
Right? And it was his snub. And the city of Spokane, bent over backwards to try to get him to change his mind on putting the railroad through Spokane. And they end up putting it through Spokane. The depot, the downtown depot, which we still have the clock tower from, was built, between 1901 and 1902.
Right.
And
the place that my grandfather proposed to my grandmother at the clock tower.
Yeah.
Cool
That's amazing. My dad remembers going down to the depot to get, Christmas presents from his grandparents. But yeah, that's the, that depot is kind of the result of the city being like, what can we do to get you to not go to Hilliard?
What's going on in Hilliard? Yeah.
Yeah, and Hilliard becomes a part of the city of Spokane in the 20s.
Okay, because it gets taken into there. Yeah, I got it.
But for a long time it was his own.
So a lot of stuff going on at the MAC. I know you wanted to kind of plug some stuff because I think people should go there more often. I know the DreamWorks exhibit's there. We're going to try to go as a whole team because it's such a part of our business. But before the end of the month, if we can.
So the DreamWorks exhibit is really cool. From an archivist,
it might be gone by the time this comes out, but still.
But from an archivist perspective, it's archives are kind of distinct from libraries and from other kind of collecting practices. So we collect things that are unpublished. Or really rare. So what this DreamWorks exhibit is really oriented on is there's a lot of animation cells and sketches, these preliminary kind of design stuff that was not intent. It's part of the creative process. It wasn't created
that may not have stuck on the wall.
Right. Yeah. It was not created to be consumed by the public in that form. It's
working
and so stuff. So it's archival material. So I always like to tell people it's an archival exhibit. It's a really cool exhibit. The MAC is actually its first U.S. location site, so we're the premier location for its U.S. tour.
Wow.
Yeah,
Paul McCartney started here. DreamWorks starts here.
This
is the starter town.
Kind of
I'll be the starter town.
Right,
Who cares?
totally down with that. So if you do have a chance, if you have a chance to see it, I would strongly encourage it. It's really cool. My kids like to go through it. They have their own favorite areas that we just go to again and again. I mean, they're museum children, so they think they own the place.
They do. They do.
Yeah.
Actually, we all do.
And then we have coming up in another gallery, we have this exhibit called Dances with Life. It's a exhibit about the artistry behind Mexican masks and the pastorales. These kind of
the Day of the Dead ish.
Yeah, they're like these religious. They fall on religious holidays, and it's all of the art that kind of is built out of it. The masks that we have, actually, we absorbed a lot of the Museum of Native American Cultures collections.
My dad had designed that building.
And Monac had collected these masks, by these modern artists. And so one of the things we're doing at the MAC is trying to kind of, again, build those personal stories into the objects. Who made these things?
I think you guys do a great
really
job
kind of
that.
Understand that idea. And these are really incredible masks. So we actually partnered with professors at Gonzaga and a couple other people that this is their specialty to help design and build this exhibit. So it's really cool because we were able, the MAC has some of these masks that then we've reconnected with the artists that made them or their families in these communities. And it's a vibrant, fun exhibit. It's bilingual, so it'll be both in Spanish and English.
When does that run?
That starts in September 3rd. So that's when it opens. And I really encourage people to go see it. It's kind of, it's the fun intersection of like history and art and culture all rolled into one, and it's a great
well, and there's some
exhibit.
Amazing people that work there. We had the fortune of, during the pandemic, one of the good parts of it for us was that the Pompeii exhibit, which was phenomenal, and only a few in the world really select cities got to be a part of that. It had shut down because no one could go, so we actually filmed it.
Yes.
And did kind of a reenactment that was really cool, and we were able to put this whole piece together and worked with Brooke, who is phenomenal.
Yeah, and that had like 2,000-year-old bread.
The bread, it was amazing. That's a piece of bread. In fact, we went to the grain shed and had them make it.
Yeah.
So they made the bread, and it was phenomenal bread.
Yeah.
We all got to eat it. It was incredible. But it was just so cool to work, to be there and be around that space. And there's just something about the night in the museum feel of that when there's nothing else going on. You're the only ones in there. And the coolest elevator, my guys still love your elevator. Like that elevator in there that has to move all these exhibits. It's this giant elevator.
It was built
Dr.
to like
Evil's,
fit our largest
Dr.
object.
Evil's elevator. I mean, it's just
huge.
really behind the scenes of that place is amazing. It's just such a treasure that we have that place here.
Absolutely.
I just help people keep going and checking out the exhibits there, because really some amazing things come here. Well, I want to thank you for being the best oversharer we've had. I know that you said that was your favorite thing. You are an
oversharing.
But thanks for being the most interesting oversharer that
I
I've
am
ever met.
happy to. And if anybody ever is curious or hears this podcast and is like, geez, I want to know more about X, Y, or Z, contact us. I mean, the nice thing is that I work in a research archive and we're publicly accessible. So, you guys came in and did photograph and video research, and that is our job. So,
so you kind of get lit up when you see people. I noticed that the other thing is like you're a great oversharer because you're really usually locked inside a small room all day long. So no wonder you're excited to talk to actual people. Please come visit. And also, if people have, really valuable things like a Bing Crosby banjo, that those are the things that you would want to at least hear about.
And we also just we're
don't
also
throw
a
them
resource.
Away necessarily.
Yeah, we're also a resource if you have stuff that you want to keep and you don't want to donate to the museum. You can still ask us how to preserve it
or house it, and you can come visit.
How to save it, those kinds of things. Because for me, I don't care if it comes to the MAC, that's great. If it doesn't come to the MAC because it's important to you or to a family member, that's okay too. As long as it's safe. So I will happily be like, here are all the things, like here's the kind of tissue you need and the box you need, and like here's how you store your photographs. We are a resource for those things too, and we want to make sure people know that you don't have to donate to the museum in order to know how to preserve your own stuff.
That's great. Well, and if anybody knows how to transfer dictaphone, give her a call.
Please, I would love to know. That would be really. We're sending them to Maryland at this point, and that's
somebody here,
pretty
please.
far away.
Well, Anna, thank you. Cheers.
Thank you.
And
have a great night.
Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
That was fun.
MIP Podcast was filmed at the studio of Corner Booth Media. Please sure to like, subscribe, and follow us on social media. You can also listen to us on Spotify, Apple Music, and anywhere podcasts can be found.
We'd love it if you'd rate, review, and subscribe to help our podcast grow. Be good to yourself and stay interesting.